They say truth has a way of waiting. You can bury it, silence it, mock it, but one day it comes roaring back louder than any machine. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that begins with laughter and ends with a reckoning. A story of a janitor's daughter, a stolen legacy, and the moment truth refused to stay hidden. If you have ever believed in the strength of underdogs, injustice rising against power, then this story will stay with you long after it ends. If stories of truth, resilience, and justice speak to your heart, make sure to follow, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. The glass tower of Stratton Dynamics shimmered against the Detroit skyline, its steel frame catching the last light of the evening. From the outside, it was a monument to progress, a fortress of invention. Inside, however, tension clung to the air like static. The top-floor laboratory smelled of heated circuits and synthetic polish, where silence was sharper than words. Every footstep echoed, every whisper carried, because in this place, failure was not an option. At the center of the room stood the Helix 12 prototype, Stratton's most ambitious project. Sleek, titanium-wrapped, with a 12-cylinder engine designed for autonomous combat vehicles, it was supposed to be the jewel of the defense industry. But for 3 long days, it refused to start. The machine sat lifeless, diagnostics flashing red, while Stratton's highest-paid engineers circled it helplessly, as though afraid to touch it. Marshall Greystone, the CEO, loomed nearby. Tall, silver-haired, and cold as glass, he embodied control. His arms were folded tight against his suit, his gaze hard enough to cut through steel. For the third time in 48 hours, his engineers tried to explain the failure. "It's not a hardware issue," the lead technician stammered. "We believe it's a misfire in the load sequence." "Think?" Marshall's voice sliced through the air. "Think is a word for interns. This team doesn't think. This team knows." No one answered. A cold hush followed. In the far corner, a janitor moved quietly, mop sliding across the floor. Henry Whitaker, 63, hunched slightly in orthopedic shoes, his presence almost invisible. He said little, listened to everything, and this night his daughter had come to bring him dinner. Ara stood near the exit, a teenager with dark curls spilling from beneath a weathered hoodie. A heavy backpack slung over her shoulder, earbuds tucked in, but no music playing. She was still, but her eyes tracked everything. The flicker of diagnostic panels, the frustration in every whispered calculation, the lifeless hush of the Helix 12. She was not supposed to be there, but she always came on Tuesdays. Her father worked late, and she never let him eat alone. Marshall's eyes wandered across the lab and landed on her. A girl out of place, small against the scale of the room. He glanced at Henry. "Is that your daughter?" Henry's mop slowed. "Yes, sir." Marshall's lips curled slightly, the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Maybe she'd like a crack at it. My engineers can't seem to solve it." A ripple of laughter moved through the lab. Not a full roar, but sharp, uneasy chuckles. Phones slid out of pockets, ready to capture humiliation. A technician nudged another. Someone whispered, "He's serious?" Ara blinked, stunned. "What?" Marshall gestured to the engine, casual and cruel. "Go on. If you're so observant back there, let's see you fix it. I'll give you a scholarship if you do." Henry opened his mouth, but Ara was already stepping forward. The laughter stumbled into silence. She walked toward the machine with steady steps, not like a child being mocked, but like someone who had already imagined this moment. She unzipped her backpack and pulled out a duct-tape notebook, worn at the edges, the kind of thing most people would throw away without a glance. She flipped to a page marked with careful folds, diagrams scribbled in blue ink, arrows and systems tangled together. The room quieted. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. Henry froze, mop in hand, watching with wide eyes. Ara placed her bag beside the machine and rolled up her sleeves. She rested one hand on the cool titanium casing as though listening for a heartbeat. She traced along the seams, searching. Then, without asking permission, she pressed against a panel. A soft click released, exposing the capacitor array. Gasps broke the silence. Colin, one of the engineers, stepped forward, his mouth opening to protest. But he didn't. Ara's eyes scanned the circuitry. Something was wrong. The power relay had been looped into a recursive crash, a logic flaw buried deep within the startup sequence. Not a hardware problem, not a manufacturing glitch, a blind spot no one else had caught. From her pocket, she pulled out a small component wrapped in tissue paper, a microcapacitor she had soldered herself for a school project. She held it like a secret weapon. "She carries parts," one technician whispered. "Look at her schematic," another murmured. "That layout, wait, that's ours." "No, cleaner, older." Ara ignored them. With quick, practiced hands, she unscrewed the flawed capacitor, slid hers into place, and rerouted two wires with an L-pin jumper taped to her notebook. She stepped back, wiping her fingers on her sleeve, dark streaks staining the fabric. "Try it now," she said quietly. Marshall raised a brow but didn't move. Colin hovered near the ignition panel, uncertain. "If this shorts," he muttered, "we'll have a fireball." "It won't," Era replied steady. "I already simulated it." He stared at her, then pressed the button. For a moment, silence. Then a low rumble, a rising roar. The Helix 12 came alive, smooth, perfect, flawless. Diagnostics flipped from red to green in a cascading glow. The pulse of power spread through the machine like breath returning to a body. No one moved, no one spoke. The hum of the engine filled the space like a truth too heavy to deny. Marshall's jaw clenched. His arms remained folded, but his eyes burned into Ara. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She only glanced at her father, a quiet acknowledgement. Henry's eyes glistened, though his face betrayed nothing. In the corner, a young technician dropped his phone. The sharp clatter echoed like a gunshot. A hand rose for applause, then stopped. The moment wasn't theirs to celebrate. Finally, Marshall spoke, his voice colder than steel. "Who are you?" Ara met his gaze, calm, steady. Her answer was simple, almost dismissive. "I just like engines." Then she picked up her bag, tucked her notebook inside, and walked toward the exit. The hum of the Helix followed her, alive, undeniable. Not one engineer dared to shut it off. Henry stood frozen, mop abandoned, watching his daughter disappear through the door. The silence that followed was heavier than all the laughter that came before. And in that silence, something far greater than an engine had begun to stir. The hum of the Helix 12 filled the laboratory, low and steady, like a heart rediscovered. Engineers stood frozen, faces pale in the green glow of diagnostic panels. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as though any sound might break the spell. Ara, sleeves rolled and hands streaked with grease, stood before the engine she had awakened. Her notebook lay open on the workbench, its pages fluttering faintly from the vent's draft. Diagrams sprawled across the paper, marked with careful notes and strange shorthand. The kind of work that did not belong in a child's hands, yet she handled it with the precision of someone born to it. Colin, still hunched near the ignition panel, stared at the flawless cycle readouts. His voice caught in his throat. "It's clean. Every sequence, perfect." Donna, a senior mechanical lead, whispered without meaning to. She didn't even hesitate, just walked up and saw it. Marshall Greystone stood motionless, his arms still folded, but his expression had shifted. His jaws was tight, his eyes narrowed, as though the control he wielded so effortlessly had slipped just slightly. He had expected laughter, humiliation, perhaps even tears. Instead, he had watched a teenage girl do what his team of experts could not. Ara stepped back, wiping the grease onto her sleeve, leaving smudges that felt almost like proof. She glanced at her father. Henry had not moved, his hands gripping the mop handle until his knuckles whitened. His eyes shimmered, but his face remained unreadable. He had spent his life cleaning the mistakes of others. Tonight, his daughter had silenced the entire room. Phones hung forgotten in hands. A recording or two had begun, but even those who pressed record seemed more entranced than opportunistic. The moment was too heavy for cheap entertainment. It felt like history, the kind of event people whispered about for decades afterward. Colin finally looked up. What kind of part was that?" Ara's voice was calm, almost dismissive. "Just a capacitor I built." "Built?" he echoed, his voice cracking. "For a school project," she added, sliding her notebook back into her bag. The murmurs spread quickly. She had parts in her pocket. Those diagrams, where did she even learn this? That schematic doesn't match our latest revision. Marshall's eyes flicked toward the open notebook before Ara closed it. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence was louder than any words. Finally he spoke, his tone like ice. Who are you? Ara met his gaze evenly. Her voice was low but steady. I just like engines. The answer hung in the air like smoke, fragile and unshakable all at once. Without another word, she shouldered her bag and turned away. The doors hissed open and she stepped through them without looking back. The helix continued to purr behind her, alive at last. No one dared to shut it down. Henry's eyes followed her until the doors closed. Only then did his grip loosen on the mop. His heart beat so loudly he could feel it in his ears. He wanted to run after her, to tell her how proud he was, but his body remained rooted to the polished floor. For decades, he had been invisible in this place. Tonight, his daughter had made the walls themselves listen. Donna moved toward the abandoned notebook. She hesitated, her hand hovering above the duct tape cover. It was still open, pages scattered with equations and sketches, some dated years before Ara could have written them. She leaned closer. This isn't ours, she whispered. Colin stepped beside her, eyes narrowing as he studied the notes. It looks like an early helix revision. But refined, smarter, stripped down. That can't be, another engineer said, his voice shaking. That version was classified. Marshall's voice cut in, sharp but uncertain. Enough. But the weight of curiosity pressed harder. The engineers exchanged glances, silent questions hanging between them. The laughter from earlier had vanished entirely. What lingered now was unease. Henry finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he set the mop against the wall. His knees ached as he bent to pick up the bucket, the water inside rippling from his trembling hands. He said nothing, but he felt every gaze in the room as he left through the service door. He had cleaned these halls his entire life, but tonight he carried more than water in his bucket. He carried the weight of a secret no one else had been meant to see. Outside, in the chill of the evening air, Ara stood beside their rusted sedan, her bag pressed to her chest. She was not smiling, not triumphant. Her face was calm, unreadable, the same way it had been inside the lab. When Henry joined her, neither spoke. He started the car, the old engine coughing to life, and they drove into the night. Back in the laboratory, the helix roared on, proof of something the company was not ready to face. Marshall remained near the observation table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly the veins in his arms stood out. He had intended to break a girl's spirit. Instead, she had lit a fuse. Donna closed the notebook carefully, her hands trembling. She knew, she said quietly. She didn't guess, she knew. The words spread across the lab, passed from one engineer to another, like sparks traveling down a fuse line. No one dared to say more, but everyone felt the truth pressing closer. And at the center of it all, the helix purred on, alive not because of Stratton Dynamics, but because a janitor's daughter had dared to touch it. The helix still hummed long after Ara and her father left the lab, its mechanical purr echoing like a reminder no one could silence. Around it, engineers lingered in stunned disbelief, staring at the success logs as though the machine had conjured life on its own. But what haunted them more than the sound was the notebook she had left behind, its pages filled with handwriting, too familiar to ignore. Donna leaned closer, her fingertips brushing the worn duct tape on the cover. Her eyes followed the neat but unpolished diagrams, the swirling arrows and handwritten corrections. Dates filled the margins, some recent, some going back years, far beyond what Ara's age could explain. She swallowed hard, her voice quiet but cutting. This handwriting, I know it. Colin glanced at her, brows furrowed. You mean hers, the girl's? No. Donna's hand trembled slightly as she pointed to the initials written in blue ink at the bottom of one schematic. M.W. Colin froze. The color drained from his face. That's not possible. It looks like early helix design, Donna pressed, flipping to another page. But smarter, refined. And those initials, I've seen them before. Years ago. A murmur spread through the lab like a chill draft. Leonard, one of the oldest analysts, stepped forward. His voice was gravelly, hesitant, as though dragging up a ghost. Marin Whitaker. The name landed like a hammer dropped on steel. Silence crashed over the room. Some younger engineers looked blank, unfamiliar. But the older ones, those who had been at Stratton long enough, knew the name. They had heard whispers, fragments of stories, spoken only in hushed tones after too much whiskey. She trained half the department, Leonard continued. Designed the first reactor core prototype, smarter than all of us combined. His eyes shifted toward the notebook. She disappeared after the accident. Donna's face had gone pale. They said it was an explosion, lab accident, confidential report. But nothing was ever released, Leonard added. No photos, no logs, just silence. Marshall had not moved from the observation table. His hands gripped the edge tighter now, his jaw locked. Enough speculation. His tone was flat, controlled, but unease bled into it. Donna ignored him. She looked back at the notebook, her voice soft but resolute. That girl, Ara, she's her daughter. The words rippled through the lab. A few sat down without realizing it. Others stared at the humming helix as though it were haunted. The laughter from earlier felt like a sin now, shame curling in the corners of their minds. Henry and Ara, meanwhile, sat quietly in their battered sedan as it rolled through the dim streets below. Neither had spoken since leaving the tower. The weight of what happened hung between them, thick as smoke. The old car's engine rattled, the only one she hadn't rebuilt. Ara's hands clutched her backpack tightly, the notebook safe in poem. Her gaze was fixed on the dark streets passing by, but her thoughts were elsewhere, in diagrams, in circuits, in the humming heartbeat of the helix she had left behind. Finally, Henry's voice broke the silence, low and rough. You used her notes. Ara nodded faintly. I finished them. His eyes shone under the glow of the streetlight as he gripped the wheel tighter. You shouldn't have had to. I didn't do it for them, she said simply, her voice calm. I did it because no one else would. Henry's throat tightened. He looked ahead, the road blurring slightly. They'll come looking. I know. Ara said it not with fear, but with certainty. He hesitated, then added, I should have told you more, about her, about what happened. Ara turned her head, her voice gentle. You told me what mattered, that she was brilliant, that they were afraid of her, that they buried her name. Henry exhaled shakily, memories pressing against him like a tide he had held back too long. She would have been proud. Ara didn't answer. She stared through the windshield as Stratton Tower shrank behind them, swallowed by the night sky. Her silence was not emptiness. It was weight, resolve, the kind that settled deep in her bones. Inside the tower, Donna remained at the glass wall overlooking the city, the hum of the helix still vibrating faintly through the floor. She whispered the name again, as though saying it might summon the woman herself. Marin Whitaker. By morning, the notebook had already slipped beyond control. Copies were made quietly, handed from engineer to assistant, whispered over coffee in break rooms, folded into files meant to disappear. Some denied what they saw. Others studied too long, recognizing the dangerous truth. Those pages were not just notes. They were a map of the company's stolen heart. Marin Whitaker's designs had not died with her. They had lived, hidden, carried forward in the hands of her daughter. Henry knew the danger of it all. He had spent years sweeping the ashes of Stratton's secrets into trash bins, discarding pages of brilliance under orders he never dared to question. But one page had survived. One notebook had escaped the flames, and Ara had taken that ember and set it burning again. As the sedan rolled into their neighborhood, Ara finally spoke, her voice steady, almost detached. It's not over. Henry didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Up in the tower, the engine continued its steady purr. To the men who once claimed it, it sounded like triumph. But to those who understood, it was something else entirely. The sound of a legacy returning, a truth too long buried, now demanding to be heard. The boardroom of Stratton Dynamics was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to intimidate. Its long table gleamed beneath recessed lights, its walls stretched from floor to ceiling in polished panes that overlooked the city. It had been built as a place where power was exercised quietly, where voices rarely rose, where decisions buried futures without leaving echoes. But today the room vibrated with something different, fear. Marshall Greystone stood at the head of the table, his suit as crisp as ever, though his posture betrayed strain. In front of him, sealed inside a transparent evidence sleeve, lay Ara's duct-tape notebook. His hands rested on either side of it as though he were trying to pin it in place, as though it might leap from the table and undo him. Around the room, members of Stratton's leadership sat stiffly in leather chairs. Faces that had once radiated confidence now carried unease, suspicion, even guilt. Near the back, Ara sat beside Henry, her posture calm, her backpack tucked close to her feet. Donna was there too, her employee badge removed from her lanyard, lying on the table in front of her like a discarded loyalty. Leonard stood to the side, clutching a file he hadn't touched in 15 years. Marshall's voice broke the silence. "So," he said slowly, "what exactly are you claiming here?" Aka's eyes met his. Her voice was cool, deliberate. "I'm not claiming anything. I showed you proof." Marshall's hand tapped the notebook sleeve. This? This is proof? Scribbles in a child's notebook?" His laugh was sharp, hollow. "You want me to believe a janitor's daughter reverse-engineered a $40 million prototype because her mother once worked here?" Ara's face didn't shift. "No, I want you to admit it wasn't your prototype to begin with." The words landed hard. A heavy silence followed, pressing against the glass walls. Leonard stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of a man who had held truth too long. "I was there the day Marin's access was revoked," he said. "I saw her designs routed through the internal servers. I saw her warnings about capacitor cycling ignored." Marshall's jaw tightened. "That's hearsay." "She tried to go public," Leonard continued, ignoring him. "A week later, she was gone. They said it was an accident, but there was no investigation file, no photos, no logs, just a cleanup order." Henry stood now. His voice was steady, though it carried years of quiet pain. "I cleaned that lab. They told me to throw away every scrap of paper with her handwriting on it, every trace, but they missed one." His gaze softened as he looked at Ara. "She took what was left and finished it." Donna added, her voice low but resolute, "and improved it." Marshall's expression flickered, though he fought to keep his tone dismissive. "You're rewriting history based on nostalgia. Regret." "No," Ara said, rising from her seat. Her steps were measured as she moved toward the head of the table. She reached into her backpack and set a flash drive on the polished surface. "Not nostalgia. Records. Every schematic my mother ever wrote, every revision, every version, up to the Helix 10. Time-stamped. Initialed." The room stilled, eyes locked on the small device as though it carried the weight of a bomb. "You didn't just steal her work," Ara continued, her voice calm, unshaken. "You buried her with it." Marshall's laugh was bitter now, an attempt to mask the fracture beneath his control. "Do you really think this makes you important?" Ara's eyes swept the room, past her father, past Donna, past Leonard, then returned to him. "I don't need to be important, but I won't let you erase her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Marshall's voice dropped, sharp as glass. "You don't have the right." It was Henry who answered. "No, but justice does." The door opened without warning. Footsteps echoed across the marble. 4 men in dark suits entered, moving with the precision of those who needed no introduction. Federal agents. They did not pause. They walked straight to the head of the table. "Marshall Greystone," the lead agent said evenly, "we need to speak with you." Marshall's face did not change at first, but his eyes betrayed him, and they flicked to the notebook, then to the flash drive, then to Ara. "You planned this," he hissed. Ara didn't blink. "No," she said quietly. "You did." The door closed behind the agents like the slam of a judge's gavel. The weight in the room shifted. This man who had ruled this tower for decades suddenly looked small, as though the glass walls themselves were pressing inward. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the city below seeped faintly through the glass, a reminder that the world outside was already changing. Then Donna rose. She unhooked her badge and let it drop onto the table with a soft clink. Her voice was steady. "I was here when Marin first proposed the dynamic fuel flow model. You laughed at her. We all did. But she was right. I stayed quiet. I won't anymore." Another engineer stood, older, his hands trembling slightly. "I remember her calculations on compressed torque. I still use them. She saved this company before you ever touched it. His badge joined hers with a dull clatter. One by one, others followed, badges dropping like the sound of chains breaking. Whispers of Marin's name passing through the room, not as a ghost anymore, but as something alive. Marshall's control unraveled before his eyes. His knuckles whitened against the table. "You think this makes you heroes?" he spat. "This changes nothing. You don't understand what this company is built on." Henry's voice answered, calm, resolute. "We know exactly what it's built on, and now the world will too." Aura reached forward, tapping the screen embedded in the table. A video played. Marshall's own voice, sneering it. "Go on, if you're so smart, fix it. I'll give you a scholarship." The laughter, the silence, the engine roaring to life, his dismissal, his denial, his words, "You don't have the right." The recording ended. The room sat in heavy silence. Marshall's face had gone pale. His voice, once sharp, cracked with desperation. "You're going to destroy this company." Aura looked at him, steady as stone. "No, you already did." From the back of the room, someone began to clap. Not applause, but acknowledgement. Another followed. Then another. It wasn't celebration, it was history shifting, the sound of silence breaking after years too long. Outside, the glass walls reflected the city, but inside, something greater reflected back. The truth, no longer buried, standing in plain sight. The boardroom still vibrated with the quiet rhythm of badges hitting the table when dawn broke over the city. By then, the walls of Stratton Dynamics no longer felt like fortresses. They felt like mirrors. For decades, they had reflected power, fear, and silence. Now they reflected something else. Fracture. It began with whispers. An engineer in the systems wing sent a message to a trusted friend. She fixed it. A junior analyst forwarded the video to a forum where old alumni of Stratton once gathered. Within hours, the recording of Era's calm voice, the mocking challenge, and the engine roaring to life had spread far beyond the building. By morning, 6 million people had watched the clip. Cafes in Detroit replayed the moment on their televisions. High school classrooms studied the footage on smuggled phones. In newsrooms across the country, anchors leaned forward as though listening to a ghost come back to life. But it was not only the fix that captured the world, it was the confrontation. The clip of Aura standing tall saying, "You didn't just steal her work, you buried her with it," echoed across headlines, across hashtags, across protests gathering at Stratton's very gates. In Washington, senators watched the video in silence inside a darkened briefing room. An advisor leaned toward the head of the Department of Scientific Ethics and whispered, "This cannot be ignored." The reply came without hesitation. "We're opening an investigation now." Back in Detroit, Stratton Dynamics found itself under siege, not from foreign competitors, but from the truth. By 10 o'clock a.m., half the staff had walked out. By noon, security guards were no longer scanning badges. They were holding doors open for reporters. What had once been silence had become a flood. Marshall Greystone remained locked in his office at the top floor, surrounded by 2 lawyers and 3 phones. Calls came without pause. Angry shareholders, desperate board members, journalists demanding statements. But none of them slowed the inevitable. He ignored the hashtags climbing across screens. #Justice for Marin, #Truth never dies, #Whitaker engine. He ignored the shareholder vote scheduled for the next morning. He ignored the press encamped outside the building. But he could not ignore the truth. At exactly 1:32 p.m., a black SUV with federal plates pulled up to Stratton's gates. No sirens, no flashing lights, just quiet certainty. Inside the building, employees gathered near screens, near cubicles, near stairwells, watching without speaking as agents entered the lobby. They did not stop at reception. They did not ask questions. They went straight to the elevator. 20 minutes later, the doors opened again, and Marshall Greystone stepped out in handcuffs. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his stride stiff but unresisting. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Reporters shouted questions. But he kept his head down. He had once walked those halls as though he owned the city. Now he walked them like a man stripped of a name. Outside, the crowd parted. Some clapped softly, others wept. Most simply watched. Not with triumph, not with pity, but with the solemnity of witnesses. This was the sound of a lie collapsing in public. On the second floor, in a forgotten conference room, Ara and Henry sat side by side. They weren't watching the news feed, so they weren't celebrating. They sat in silence, the hum of an old radiator filling the space. Henry finally broke the quiet, his voice hoarse. "I never thought we'd see this day." Ara stared at the floor, her hands folded in her lap. "I didn't either. I just wanted to bring you dinner." She stopped, her voice catching for the first time since the lab. "Ito, I didn't know." Henry turned to her, his eyes damp, his smile aching. "You did exactly what she would have done." Ara shook her head. "She would have done it better." He let out a small laugh, broken and tender. "She would have said the same thing about you." At 3:17 p.m., a new message appeared on Stratton's internal network. It was only a sentence, stark against the white screen. "Effective immediately, Marshal Greystone has been placed on indefinite leave pending federal investigation." Below it, another line appeared. "The Stratton executive team recognizes the contributions of Marin and Ara Whitaker to the Helix development program. A formal statement and reattribution process will follow." No name was attached. It did not matter. Across the city, a digital billboard lit up, not with a product, not with a patent, but with two faces side by side. Marin Whitaker, Ara Whitaker. Beneath them, two words glowed in bold white letters: "Truth rises." By nightfall, Stratton Dynamics was trending in every state, not for its innovation, not for its market share, but for the scandal that had been buried for 15 years. The story was no longer confined to boardrooms and labs. It belonged to the world now. In homes and offices, in classrooms and subways, people repeated the same truth. The company's greatest invention had not been born in its laboratories, but stolen from a woman they tried to erase. And her daughter had brought her back. Henry and Ara returned home that night to their small apartment, walls lined with books, shelves crowded with tools and wires. The quiet was heavy, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of something shifting, something too large to name. Henry sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped. Ara stood by the window, staring out at the faint glow of the city. For the first time, the tower no longer dominated the skyline in her eyes. For the first time, it looked small. Neither spoke for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, old and uneven. Finally, Ara whispered, more to herself than to him, "It's not over." Henry didn't argue. He knew she was right. The truth had risen, but the fight was only beginning. And somewhere in the heart of Detroit, in living rooms, in offices, in quiet conversations between strangers, a name once buried began to rise again, carried by voices unafraid to speak it aloud. Marin Whitaker. A week later, Stratton's glass tower stood hushed against the Detroit skyline. Its marble floors gleamed, its polished halls stretched wide, but the air was different. The nameplate outside Marshal Greystone's office had been removed, the blinds drawn, the door sealed. For the first time in decades, silence filled Stratton, not as control, but as consequence. Outside those walls, however, something new had begun to move. Ara Whitaker stood on the steps of the State Science Commission building in Washington, D.C. Her borrowed blazer hung slightly loose on her shoulders. Her jeans still carried faint stains of engine oil, and her hands trembled only when no one was watching. Before her stretched a crowd of cameras, journalists, and flashing lights. Behind her stood Henry, quiet and steady, and beside him a woman Ara had not expected to see, Olivia Whitaker, her grandmother. Olivia's silver hair was pinned back, her green coat pressed sharp as if time itself had not touched her. Ara had not even known she was alive, but the moment she stepped out of the black town car, the connection was undeniable. The same eyes, the same quiet strength, the same weight of legacy. When they embraced for the first time, Olivia whispered, "I kept everything. Your mother's notes, her letters, her photos. I knew someday this would come back." Now the three of them stood together, 3 generations bound not only by blood, but by a truth no longer buried. Inside the building, Calvin Rohr, head of the Department of Scientific Ethics, approached with a simple blue folder. His expression was solemn, but his voice carried the calm of resolution. "Miss Whitaker," he said, holding it out. Ara opened it carefully. Inside was a signed letter from 5 senators, a grant document, and a project proposal. At the top, bold letters read, "The Whitaker Initiative." She read slowly, her breath catching at every line. A national program to protect and fund young inventors. A center for ethical innovation. A research facility built in Marin Whitaker's name. One key condition was written clearly. Ara Whitaker would chair the advisory board. Her voice cracked softly. "This is real?" Calvin nodded. "Your mother's work deserved a future. Now it has one." Ara passed the folder to Henry, her hands trembling. He read every word twice before handing it to Olivia, whose tears came silently. Her lips moved around a name she had never forgotten, whispering it like a prayer. Marin. Later that evening, they returned not to a stage or a grand hall, but to a community center in Detroit, a place Marin herself had once helped build. The city had offered a public auditorium, but Era refused. "I don't like spotlights," she had said. "I like rooms where people listen." The small auditorium filled quickly. Children crowded the front row, clutching notebooks and toy engines, their eyes wide. Parents and teachers lined the back, reporters pressed against the walls. But the heart of the room belonged to the children. Some didn't fully understand the story, but they felt its weight. Ara stepped forward carrying her mother's violin. It had been found wrapped in a blanket, untouched for 15 years. Its strings had been replaced, its bow repaired, but the wood still carried memory. The room hushed as she raised it to her shoulder. The first note whispered into the air, soft as breath in winter. Then it grew, clear, strong, resonant. Each note threaded through the silence, weaving together fragments of a story unfinished. Her mother's brilliance, her father's silence, her own defiance. When the final chord faded, no one clapped. No one dared to break the moment. They sat in silence, transformed. As the crowd dispersed, a small girl approached, a worn notebook clutched to her chest. Her voice was a whisper. "My name is Lena. I want to build engines too." Ara knelt, her smile gentle. "Then you already are." She took the child's hand and led her to the table where Marin's blueprints rested behind glass. "Start here," she said softly, "but don't stop here." Lena nodded, her eyes shining. Behind them, Henry wiped his face with a handkerchief. Olivia placed her hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady and proud. Outside, Detroit's skyline shimmered, neon lights flickering like a promise. Steam curled from street grates. Trains rumbled in the distance, carrying the city forward. Inside the newly christened Whitaker Center for Ethical Innovation, exhibits stood silent under soft golden light. At the atrium's heart, one display remained lit through the night. Behind glass rested 2 objects. On the left, the tattered duct-tape notebook, its pages yellowed and ink smudged. On the right, the restored brass violin, polished until it glowed. Below them, a plaque was etched in steel. "To those who were silenced, and those who choose to speak, truth does not fade, it waits." Ara stood before it, Bakhtiari after the others had gone. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, aligning with her mother's in the faint light. 2 women, 2 minds, 1 legacy. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stood until the silence felt complete. Then slowly she turned and walked down the hallway toward the exit, her shadow stretching long behind her, like memory itself. Outside, the wind carried a faint thread of music, soft and fleeting. No one could say where it came from. Some swore it sounded like strings, others like the hum of an engine. But those who heard it felt the same certainty. Something had returned home. And in that quiet, beneath the shimmer of a city just beginning to wake, the legacy of Marine and Ara Whitaker stood unshakable. Not as myth, not as rumor, but as truth finally risen.